The quietest man in prison was hiding the loudest story. The transport bus rolled through the final security gate just after sunrise, its tires crunching across the gravel road leading into Blackstone Correctional Facility. Inside, most of the inmates stared through the reinforced windows or kept their eyes fixed on the floor. Among them sat Elijah Brooks, a 58-year-old black man with graying hair and calm eyes. He carried a small property bag on his lap and showed no sign of nervousness. That alone made him unusual. Most new arrivals looked tense. Some looked angry. Others looked frightened. Elijah looked like a man waiting for a delayed flight. When the bus stopped, the inmates were escorted through intake processing. Names were called. Fingerprints were taken. Instructions were repeated. Elijah listened carefully, answered politely, and moved through every step without complaint. He spoke only when necessary. By mid-morning, he entered the housing unit that would become his new home. The moment he stepped inside, dozens of eyes turned toward him. Prison was a place where people constantly measured one another. Age, size, confidence, reputation, every detail mattered. Elijah immediately stood out. He was older than most inmates, moved at an unhurried pace, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that seemed out of place. At a table near the center of the common area sat Mason Carter. At 36 years old, Mason was one of the largest inmates in Blackstone and one of the most influential. He noticed Elijah within seconds. While others returned to their conversations, Mason continued watching. New arrivals usually tried to look tough or avoid attention altogether. Elijah did neither. He simply walked to an empty seat and began reading a worn paperback book from his property bag. Mason smirked. To him, the older inmate looked like an easy target. Across the room, another inmate named Thomas Reed noticed the same thing. Unlike Mason, Thomas felt curious rather than amused. Something about Elijah seemed different. He could not explain why. The afternoon passed quietly. Elijah attended orientation, learned the daily schedule, and familiarized himself with the housing unit. He asked thoughtful questions and listened more than he spoke. Several inmates attempted small talk. Elijah responded politely, but never volunteered much information about himself. The silence only made him more noticeable. During dinner, the cafeteria buzzed with noise. Conversations echoed across the room while trays moved steadily through serving lines. Elijah selected a seat near the wall and began eating alone. Mason sat several tables away with a group of followers. Every few minutes he glanced toward the older inmate. Eventually one of his friends noticed. "What is so interesting?" the man asked. Mason shrugged. "Something about him." "The old guy." Mason nodded. "Yeah, he looks too comfortable." The comment drew laughter, but Mason remained serious. Comfortable was exactly the word. Elijah did not seem like someone trying to survive his first day in prison. He seemed like someone who had already accepted every possible outcome. Later that evening, inmates gathered in the common area before lights out. Television screens flickered overhead. Conversations drifted from sports to family to rumors spreading through the facility. Elijah sat quietly with his book. At one point, a loud disagreement erupted nearby. Several inmates raised their voices. Others turned to watch. Elijah briefly looked up, observed the situation, and then returned to reading. The argument ended minutes later. Thomas happened to notice the exchange. Most people would have been distracted. Elijah appeared completely unaffected. As the housing unit settled for the night, Mason watched the older man one final time. He expected signs of fear, uncertainty, or weakness. Instead, he saw something else. Discipline. The realization bothered him more than he cared to admit. Across the room, Elijah placed his book beside his bunk and prepared for sleep. Around him, Blackstone Correctional Facility followed its usual routine. Yet unknown to everyone inside those walls, the quiet prisoner who attracted so little attention on paper was carrying a past that would eventually change the way the entire prison saw him. And the first person determined to test him had already made his decision. The next morning began before sunrise. Harsh fluorescent lights flickered on throughout the housing unit, and the familiar sounds of prison routine quickly followed. Metal bunks creaked. Shoes touched concrete floors. Conversations started in low voices before gradually growing louder. Elijah Brooks rose from his bunk without hesitation. While many inmates moved with the sluggish pace of men who wanted a few more minutes of sleep, Elijah was already dressed and prepared within minutes. He folded his blanket neatly, organized his small personal items, and waited calmly for the morning count. Across the room, Mason Carter noticed. He had expected the older inmate to look tired or overwhelmed after his first night inside Blackstone. Instead, Elijah appeared focused and completely at ease. The observation irritated him more than he understood. After breakfast, inmates moved toward their assigned work details and programs. Elijah had been assigned temporarily to the library. The assignment surprised several inmates who assumed new arrivals would receive less desirable tasks. Elijah accepted the position without comment. By mid-morning, he was quietly shelving books, organizing materials, and learning the layout of the facility. Thomas Reed happened to visit the library that day and immediately noticed something unusual. Most new inmates spent their first weeks asking questions about prison life. Elijah spent his time studying maps of the facility, reading program schedules, and observing routines. He never appeared anxious. Instead, he looked like a man gathering information. Thomas found that interesting. Meanwhile, Mason had made up his mind. The quiet newcomer had become a source of curiosity throughout the housing unit, and Mason disliked anything he could not immediately understand. During lunch, he sat with several members of his group while watching Elijah take the same seat near the wall. The older inmate opened a book while eating and paid little attention to the room around him. One of Mason's friends laughed. "I still think he looks like somebody's grandfather who got lost." Several people chuckled. Mason smiled but continued watching. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe he is trying too hard to look harmless." The comment lingered in his mind throughout the afternoon. Later that day, a small incident caught Thomas's attention. While inmates returned from recreation, one man accidentally dropped a stack of paperwork near the entrance to the housing unit. Pages scattered across the floor. Several inmates walked past without stopping. Elijah quietly stepped forward, helped gather the papers, handed them back, and continued walking. The entire interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet something about it stood out. In prison, simple acts of courtesy often disappeared beneath daily survival. Elijah seemed unwilling to let that happen. That evening, Mason finally approached him. The common area buzzed with activity as inmates watched television and played cards. Elijah sat alone reading. Mason stopped beside the table. Conversations nearby immediately grew quieter. People sensed something was about to happen. Elijah looked up from his book. His expression remained calm. Mason studied him for a moment. "You always this quiet?" he asked. Elijah closed the book and smiled politely. "Usually." A few inmates laughed. Mason expected nervousness. Instead, he received a simple answer delivered without fear or challenge. "You got a problem talking?" Mason asked. Elijah shook his head. "No, I just prefer listening first." The response seemed harmless, yet it somehow shifted the mood. Several inmates exchanged glances. Mason felt the conversation slipping away from his control. Before he could continue, Elijah added something unexpected. "You can learn a lot when you listen." For a second, nobody spoke. The words were respectful, calm, ordinary, yet they carried an unusual weight. Mason eventually stepped back and shrugged. "Whatever you say." As he walked away, he felt strangely unsettled. Across the room, Thomas had witnessed the entire exchange. Most people would have become defensive under attention from someone like Mason. Elijah had done the opposite. He remained calm, without appearing weak. That distinction lingered in Thomas's thoughts long after lights out. And as Elijah returned to his book beneath the dim housing unit lights, more than one inmate began wondering the same thing. What kind of man could stay that composed in a place designed to test everyone who entered it? Over the next several days, Elijah Brooks settled into the rhythm of Blackstone Correctional Facility with a level of ease that continued attracting attention. The prison operated on routine: count times, meal times, work assignments, recreation periods. Most inmates eventually adapted to the structure, but Elijah seemed to understand it almost immediately. He arrived early to every assignment, followed instructions carefully, and rarely wasted motion. The behavior itself was not unusual. What made people notice was the consistency. No matter what happened around him, Elijah remained calm. One afternoon during recreation, Thomas Reed sat on a bench near the walking track and watched the yard. Groups of inmates clustered together beneath the afternoon sun. Some played basketball. Others walked laps. A few simply stood around talking. Elijah moved steadily around the track alone. His pace never changed. His posture remained upright. His eyes quietly scanned the environment without appearing suspicious. Thomas frowned. There was something familiar about the way Elijah observed the yard. He noticed entrances, exits, blind corners, staff positions, the locations of every group. It did not look like nervousness. It looked like habit. Across the yard, Mason Carter noticed it too. "Look at him," one of Mason's friends said. "He walks the same route every day." Mason watched silently. The older inmate completed another lap. "Yeah," Mason replied. "And he notices everything." That observation lingered longer than he expected. Later that evening, a maintenance issue temporarily disrupted activity inside the housing unit. One section of the common area was closed while staff addressed the problem. Several inmates complained about the inconvenience. Others argued about where to sit. Elijah simply moved to another location and continued reading. The situation should have been insignificant, yet something unexpected happened. Before staff finished explaining the temporary changes, Elijah had already chosen one of the few spots that avoided congestion and allowed easy access to the library corridor. Thomas noticed immediately. "How did you know that would be the best place?" he asked later. Elijah glanced up from his book. "I looked around." Thomas laughed. "Most people looked around." Elijah smiled slightly. "Most people only look at what is directly in front of them." The answer sounded simple. Yet Thomas found himself thinking about it long afterward. The next morning brought another unusual moment. During breakfast, an inmate accidentally spilled part of his tray while carrying it through the crowded cafeteria. Food scattered across the floor. Frustration spread immediately. Several inmates groaned. A few stepped aside to avoid the mess. Elijah was one of the first people to help clear the area so nobody would slip. Again, the action was small. Again, it stood out. Not because helping was extraordinary, but because Elijah seemed to notice problems before anyone else did. As the week continued, whispers began circulating through the housing unit. Nobody knew much about Elijah, yet everyone seemed to have a theory. Some believed he had worked in law enforcement. Others guessed he had been a teacher. A few suggested he might have served in the military. The last theory gained attention because of his habits. The discipline, the awareness, the calm demeanor. None of it matched the image people expected from an ordinary inmate. Thomas found himself increasingly curious. One afternoon, he entered the library and discovered Elijah studying a map of the facility posted near the entrance. "Planning an escape?" Thomas joked. Elijah chuckled softly. "No. Then why spend so much time studying layouts?" Elijah looked at the map for another moment. "Understanding your environment makes life easier." The answer sounded reasonable. Yet Thomas could not shake the feeling that there was more behind it. That night, as lights out approached, Mason sat on his bunk watching Elijah across the room. The older man had become a puzzle nobody could solve. He never acted tough, never sought attention, never bragged. Yet somehow he carried himself like a person completely comfortable under pressure. Mason had seen confidence before. This felt different. And for the first time since Elijah arrived, Mason began wondering whether the quiet prisoner was hiding something far more significant than anyone realized. By the beginning of Elijah Brooks's second week at Blackstone Correctional Facility, curiosity about him had grown far beyond a few passing conversations. People still knew almost nothing about his past, yet more inmates were paying attention. The reason was simple. Elijah continued doing things that seemed ordinary at first glance, but unusual upon closer inspection. He never rushed. He never appeared distracted. And somehow he always seemed to understand situations before everyone else did. One afternoon during recreation, a disagreement developed between two inmates waiting to use a fitness station. It was not a serious problem, but voices gradually became louder as frustration built. Several nearby inmates turned to watch. Others moved closer, expecting the situation to continue. Elijah happened to be walking laps nearby when he noticed the gathering crowd. He slowed his pace for a moment, observed the situation, and quietly approached. Thomas Reed happened to be sitting on a bench close enough to hear what followed. Elijah did not lecture anyone. He did not tell people what to do. Instead, he calmly asked a simple question. "What exactly are both of you trying to accomplish?" The question seemed almost strange. The two inmates stopped talking long enough to answer. Within a minute, Elijah suggested a straightforward solution that allowed both men to use the equipment without creating further problems. The disagreement ended almost immediately. Several inmates looked surprised. The solution itself was not remarkable. What stood out was how quickly Elijah identified it. As he walked away, one inmate shook his head. How does he keep doing that? Thomas found himself wondering the same thing. Later that day, Elijah reported to the library for his work assignment. The library remained one of the quietest places inside Blackstone. Most inmates visited only when necessary. Elijah seemed to enjoy it. He organized shelves, sorted donations, and occasionally recommended books to other inmates. Over time, more people began asking for his suggestions. His recommendations were rarely what they expected. Instead of selecting the most popular titles, he often chose books focused on leadership, discipline, history, or personal growth. When asked why, Elijah usually gave the same answer. The right book can save years of mistakes. That evening, Mason Carter sat with several members of his group in the cafeteria. The conversation eventually turned toward Elijah. One man laughed and described how the older inmate had settled a disagreement in the recreation yard earlier that afternoon. Another mentioned seeing Elijah help several inmates find study materials in the library. The story sounded harmless, but Mason listened carefully. Every day seemed to bring another example of Elijah influencing people without trying. That bothered him. Maybe he just likes giving advice, one inmate suggested. Mason shook his head. No, there is something else. Nobody disagreed. Deep down, many of them felt the same way. The mystery surrounding Elijah continued growing. The following morning brought another unexpected moment. During a routine work detail briefing, a staff member explained changes to several assignments. The instructions were confusing enough that multiple inmates asked for clarification. Before anyone else fully understood the adjustment, Elijah quietly summarized the entire change in 2 clear sentences. The explanation was accurate. Even the staff member nodded in agreement. Several inmates exchanged glances. Once again, Elijah had processed information faster than everyone around him. Thomas noticed it immediately. More importantly, he noticed a pattern. Whether the situation involved people, schedules, problems, or decisions, Elijah seemed unusually skilled at analyzing what mattered and ignoring what did not. That ability reminded Thomas of someone. He just could not remember who. As lights out approached that night, Thomas sat on his bunk reviewing the events of the past week. The calm confidence, the awareness, the leadership, the discipline. The pieces felt connected somehow. Across the room, Elijah read quietly beneath the dim housing unit lights. Around him, conversations gradually faded as inmates prepared for sleep. Yet before turning off his light, Thomas found himself looking toward the older man one final time. For the first time since Elijah arrived, Thomas became convinced of something. The quiet prisoner was not simply a thoughtful man. He had spent years learning skills most people never developed. The question was where? And somewhere inside Blackstone, that answer was slowly moving closer to the surface. By the middle of Elijah Brooks's second week at Blackstone Correctional Facility, the mystery surrounding him had become impossible for Thomas Reed to ignore. Every day seemed to provide another clue. None of the clues were dramatic. None revealed anything specific. Yet together they painted a picture that did not fit the image of an ordinary inmate. Elijah noticed details other people missed. He remained calm under pressure. He solved problems quickly. Most importantly, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years operating in demanding environments. Thomas had reached a simple conclusion. Elijah's past contained something important. He just did not know what it was. The thought stayed with him throughout the week. During recreation one afternoon, Thomas watched Elijah complete his usual laps around the yard. The older man followed nearly the same route every day. At first glance, the routine appeared repetitive. After closer observation, Thomas noticed something else. Elijah never seemed distracted. While walking, he observed entrances, staff movements, maintenance activity, and inmate behavior without appearing obvious about it. It was as though his mind constantly processed information from every direction. Thomas had seen similar awareness before, but only in documentaries and interviews involving military personnel. The realization caught him by surprise. Could Elijah have served in the military? The possibility lingered in his thoughts. Later that day, Thomas visited the library during a quiet period. Elijah was organizing returned books behind a desk near the back wall. As usual, he greeted Thomas politely. "Find anything interesting?" Elijah asked. Thomas smiled. "Maybe." He picked up a history book from a nearby shelf and sat down. For several minutes, Neither spoke. Then Thomas decided to ask a question. Have you always been this observant? Elijah looked amused. Observant. You notice things before everyone else. Elijah considered the question for a moment. Observation is a skill. Where did you learn it? Thomas asked. For the first time, Elijah paused slightly longer than usual. Life teaches a lot of lessons. The answer was polite. It also revealed absolutely nothing. Thomas laughed. You are good at avoiding questions. Elijah smiled. Some questions have longer answers than others. The exchange ended there, but Thomas felt more convinced than ever that Elijah was intentionally protecting parts of his history. Across the facility, Mason Carter was noticing similar things. Although he would never admit it openly, his opinion of Elijah had started changing. The older inmates still refused to seek attention. Yet people increasingly listened when he spoke. Staff members seemed to respect him. Inmates sought his advice. Even Mason's own friends occasionally mentioned Elijah's insights during conversations. The shift bothered him because he did not understand it. Respect in prison usually followed predictable rules. Elijah seemed to be creating it through entirely different means. One evening during dinner, another small moment added fuel to the growing curiosity. A new inmate entered the cafeteria looking nervous and uncertain. Before anyone else reacted, Elijah quietly invited him to sit nearby and explained several basic routines that would help him adjust. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Yet by the time it ended, the new inmate looked noticeably more relaxed. Thomas witnessed the interaction from across the room. Once again, Elijah displayed the same qualities: awareness, leadership, calm. The pattern continued repeating itself. That night, Thomas made a decision. If Elijah was unwilling to discuss his past, perhaps information could be found elsewhere. Blackstone's library contained archives, newspapers, and old publications. It was not much, but it was a place to start. The following day, after completing his work assignment, Thomas began searching. He had no clear plan, only curiosity. He reviewed old newspaper collections and public records available through the library system. Hours passed without results. Then, just before leaving, he discovered something unexpected. Buried within an old article index was a familiar name: Elijah Brooks. Thomas stared at the screen. The reference provided almost no details, just a name and a publication date from years earlier. Yet it was enough to make his pulse quicken. For the first time, he had found evidence that Elijah's story extended far beyond the walls of Blackstone. And as he copied the reference number onto a piece of paper, Thomas realized the search had only just begun. The discovery stayed on Thomas Reed's mind for the next 2 days. The reference he found in the library archive was frustratingly small. One name, one publication date, almost no context. Yet it was the first piece of evidence suggesting Elijah Brooks had a documented history beyond the prison walls. For Thomas, that was enough. During every free moment, he returned to the library determined to learn more. Meanwhile, Elijah continued following his routine as though nothing had changed. He worked in the library, walked laps during recreation, and spent evenings reading. If he noticed Thomas becoming increasingly curious, he never mentioned it. By Thursday afternoon, Thomas finally located the publication connected to the archived reference. It was an old regional newspaper stored in digital format. As he opened the article, his expectations remained modest. He assumed he would find a brief mention of Elijah in connection with community work or some local event. Instead, the headline immediately caught his attention. The article described a ceremony honoring several military veterans for their service and leadership. Thomas sat up straighter. His eyes quickly moved through the story. There, halfway down the page, appeared the name Elijah Brooks. The article included only a few sentences about him, but those sentences changed everything. Elijah had served in the United States military. Thomas reread the paragraph twice to make sure he understood correctly. Suddenly, dozens of observations began connecting together. The awareness, the discipline, the calm demeanor, the ability to remain composed under pressure. The habits he displayed every day inside Blackstone. For the first time, a clear explanation existed. Yet the article also raised new questions. It mentioned military service, but offered almost no details. No branch, no rank, no specific role. The information felt incomplete. Thomas printed a copy of the article summary and folded it into his notebook. That evening, he studied Elijah from across the housing unit. The older inmate looked exactly the same as always. He sat quietly reading beneath the overhead lights while conversations drifted around him. Nobody looking at him would guess that he had once worn a military uniform. The thought fascinated Thomas. Across the room, Mason Carter was experiencing a different kind of curiosity. Although he still did not trust Elijah completely, he could no longer dismiss him. Too many unusual things kept happening. Earlier that day, a work assignment schedule changed unexpectedly. While several inmates complained about confusion, Elijah had calmly explained the revised schedule to a group of frustrated men in less than a minute. Somehow, he always seemed prepared for situations before they developed. Mason noticed. Everyone noticed. The difference was that Mason could not stop thinking about it. The following afternoon, Thomas approached Elijah during recreation. They walked several laps around the track before Thomas finally spoke. "Were you in the military?" he asked. The question hung in the air between them. Elijah continued walking for several seconds before answering. "Yes." Thomas waited for more. None came. "For a long time?" Thomas asked. Elijah nodded. "Long enough." Thomas laughed softly. "You really do not like talking about yourself." Elijah smiled. "Most stories sound more interesting to the people hearing them than the people living them." The answer only deepened the mystery. If military service explained some of Elijah's habits, it certainly did not explain everything. There was still too much confidence, too much leadership, too much experience hidden beneath the surface. That night, Thomas returned to the library archive after dinner. Using the military reference as a starting point, he expanded his search. The process moved slowly. Most results led nowhere. Then, just before the library closed, another article appeared. This one was older and far more interesting. It referenced a military training program and included Elijah's name among a group of highly respected participants. Thomas felt a rush of excitement. This was no longer a random veteran recognition article. This suggested something larger, something significant. As he copied the reference information into his notebook, he realized the picture was beginning to change. Elijah Brooks was not simply a veteran. Every new discovery pointed toward a man who had carried serious responsibility. The question was how much. And somewhere inside Blackstone Correctional Facility, the answer was waiting to be uncovered. Thomas Reed barely slept that night. The second article he had discovered remained fixed in his mind. Unlike the earlier reference, this one hinted at something much larger. Elijah Brooks had not simply served in the military. The article described him as a participant in a highly selective training program known for producing exceptional leaders. The details were limited, but the language stood out. Words like discipline, responsibility, and operational excellence appeared throughout the piece. Thomas knew enough to understand that people were not described that way by accident. The following morning, he arrived at the library earlier than usual. While Elijah quietly organized returned books nearby, Thomas continued his search. He worked carefully, cross-referencing names, dates, and archived publications. Most results led nowhere. Then, shortly before lunch, he found another clue. This time it was a brief mention in a veterans community newsletter. The article highlighted several former service members who had dedicated years to mentoring younger personnel. Once again, Elijah's name appeared. Thomas leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every document described the same qualities he had witnessed inside Blackstone: leadership, patience, calm decision-making. The prison had not changed Elijah. It had merely revealed who he already was. Meanwhile, across the facility, Mason Carter continued noticing subtle changes in the housing unit. More inmates were approaching Elijah for advice. Some asked about educational programs. Others sought help resolving minor disagreements. Elijah never acted like an authority figure. He simply listened and offered practical suggestions. Yet people consistently walked away feeling better. Mason found the phenomenon difficult to understand. Influence inside prison usually came from reputation, size, or connections. Elijah seemed to gain respect through something entirely different. During recreation that afternoon, Mason watched from a distance as two younger inmates spoke with Elijah near the walking track. The conversation appeared ordinary. There was no audience, no dramatic moment. Yet both men thanked Elijah before leaving. Mason frowned. He could not remember the last time he had seen inmates voluntarily seek guidance from someone with no obvious power. Later that evening, Thomas decided to ask a different question. While helping Elijah organize a shipment of donated books, he casually mentioned the military references he had discovered. Elijah listened quietly without interruption. When Thomas finished speaking, the older man simply nodded. "You have been busy," Elijah said. Thomas laughed. "Maybe a little." Elijah placed another book on the shelf. "And what have you learned?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "I learned that you are not who people think you are." For the first time, Elijah paused. A faint smile appeared on his face. "Most people are more complicated than they seem." The answer sounded simple, but Thomas sensed something deeper beneath it. He wanted to ask more questions. Instead, he remained silent. After a few moments, Elijah spoke again. "Be careful about building stories from incomplete information." Thomas looked surprised. "What do you mean?" Elijah adjusted a stack of books before answering. "Sometimes a few facts can create the wrong picture." The statement lingered in Thomas's thoughts long after their conversation ended. That night, he returned to the archive database one more time. Hours passed as he searched through older records. Then, just before the library closed, he found something that stopped him cold. It was not an article. It was a scan program booklet from a military recognition event many years earlier. Several distinguished guests were listed inside. Near the center of the page appeared Elijah Brooks. Unlike previous references, this entry included a short description. Thomas read the sentence twice. Then a third time. His heart began racing. The discovery confirmed beyond any doubt that Elijah had served in combat environments. Yet, even more surprising, it suggested he had earned a level of respect far beyond what Thomas imagined. As he stared at the screen, one realization became impossible to ignore. The quiet prisoner reading books in Blackstone's library had spent years operating in situations most people could barely imagine. And for the first time, Thomas began to suspect that the biggest part of Elijah's story had not yet been discovered. The discovery Thomas Reed made in the archive changed the way he viewed Elijah Brooks, but it also created a new problem. The more he learned, the less he understood. Every document pointed toward a man who had earned extraordinary respect during his years of military service. Yet Elijah himself seemed completely uninterested in discussing any of it. He continued following the same routine every day. He reported to the library. He walked laps around the recreation yard. He read books during the evening. Nothing about his behavior suggested a man seeking recognition. If anything, Elijah appeared determined to avoid it. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside Blackstone continued shifting. More inmates now greeted Elijah when passing through the housing unit. Some stopped to ask questions about educational programs. Others asked for advice about family relationships, personal goals, or simply how to stay focused during difficult days. Elijah never acted like an expert. He listened first. Then he responded with simple observations that somehow carried unusual weight. One afternoon, Mason Carter experienced this firsthand. A scheduling issue had created confusion regarding a vocational training program several inmates wanted to join. The situation was not serious, but frustration spread quickly. Several men complained that opportunities were limited and that nothing would improve. Mason happened to be nearby when Elijah quietly joined the conversation. He listened for a few moments before speaking. "If 10 people spend an hour complaining, nothing changes," Elijah said. "If 10 people spend an hour preparing, someone gets the opportunity when it arrives." The group fell silent. The statement was simple, yet nobody immediately argued with it. Even Mason found himself thinking about the comment long after the conversation ended. Later that evening, he surprised himself by approaching Elijah voluntarily. The older man sat in the common area reading as usual. Mason stopped beside the table. "You really think preparation matters that much?" he asked. Elijah looked up. "More than most people realize." Mason pulled out a chair and sat down. Several nearby inmates noticed immediately. This was the longest conversation the two men had ever shared. "What if opportunities never come?" Mason asked. Elijah closed his book. "Then preparation still changes the person doing it." The answer lingered in the air. For a moment, Mason did not know what to say. He had expected advice. Instead, he received perspective. Across the room, Thomas watched the exchange unfold with growing interest. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Weeks earlier, Mason had viewed Elijah as an easy target. Now he was listening carefully to every word. The next morning, another unexpected development occurred. During recreation, a younger inmate approached Elijah seeking guidance about earning a high school equivalency diploma. Within minutes, 2 more inmates joined the conversation. By the end of the hour, a small group had formed around a picnic table discussing education, goal setting, and future plans. Elijah never positioned himself at the center of attention, yet people naturally gravitated toward him. Thomas noticed that even staff members occasionally paused to listen when Elijah spoke. Respect was growing throughout Blackstone, and it was happening without force, reputation, or status. That realization fascinated everyone who paid attention. Later that week, Thomas returned to the archives searching for answers. This time he discovered a photograph from years earlier. The image showed a group of military personnel standing together during a formal event. Elijah appeared among them. He looked younger, but the expression was exactly the same. Calm, focused, disciplined. Beneath the photograph was a caption that stopped Thomas cold. It referenced a combat veteran leadership program reserved for individuals with exceptional service records. Thomas stared at the screen for several seconds. Combat veteran. The words explained so much. Yet they also raised the stakes dramatically. The quiet prisoner sitting in Blackstone's library had not simply served in the military. He had served in combat environments and earned recognition afterward. As Thomas slowly printed the page, one realization became impossible to ignore. The truth about Elijah Brooks was finally beginning to emerge. And once that truth spread through Blackstone Correctional Facility, nothing inside the housing unit would remain quite the same. The truth began spreading through Blackstone Correctional Facility faster than Thomas Reed expected. He had not intended to share what he discovered, but information had a way of moving through prison walls. A conversation in the library became a conversation in the housing unit. A conversation in the housing unit became a discussion in the recreation yard. Within days, inmates across the facility were quietly repeating the same surprising fact. Elijah Brooks was a combat veteran. The reaction was immediate. Some people expressed respect. Others expressed disbelief. A few insisted the story had been exaggerated. Yet nobody could ignore how perfectly the revelation matched everything they had already witnessed. The discipline, the awareness, the calm under pressure. Suddenly those qualities made sense. What surprised everyone most was Elijah's complete indifference to the attention. He never confirmed the rumors publicly. He never corrected them either. He simply continued living exactly as he had before. One afternoon during recreation, several inmates approached him directly. They asked about military service. They asked about leadership. They asked about difficult decisions. Elijah listened patiently before answering. Most people think experience teaches confidence, he said. What it really teaches is responsibility. The group fell silent. The statement was simple, but it carried weight. As word continued spreading, Mason Carter found himself reflecting on the first day Elijah arrived. He remembered assuming the older man would be easy to intimidate. He remembered dismissing him as weak because he was quiet. The memory now felt embarrassing. The more Mason observed Elijah, the more he realized he had completely misunderstood him. One evening, while inmates gathered in the common area, a television program featured a segment about veterans returning to civilian life. Several people watched casually. Elijah happened to be reading nearby. One inmate jokingly asked if the program reminded him of old times. Elijah smiled politely. It reminds me that every chapter eventually ends. The answer puzzled some people. Others found themselves thinking about it long after the conversation ended. Later that week, Thomas made another discovery. While reviewing additional archive materials, he uncovered a brief interview conducted years earlier. The interviewer had asked Elijah what quality mattered most during difficult situations. Thomas expected a complicated answer. Instead, Elijah's response filled only one sentence. Stay calm long enough to see clearly. Thomas stared at the words. They perfectly described the man living inside Blackstone today. Nothing had changed. The qualities people admired now had existed for years. The realization made the mystery even more fascinating. During the following days, inmates increasingly sought Elijah's perspective. Some asked about education. Others asked about personal goals. A few simply wanted someone to listen. Elijah never claimed to have all the answers. He usually responded with questions of his own. What are you trying to accomplish? What matters most to you? What happens if you stay on your current path? Those questions forced people to think differently. Slowly, small changes began appearing throughout the housing unit. More inmates enrolled in educational programs. More people spent time reading. Conversations became less focused on complaints and more focused on possibilities. Even staff members noticed the shift. Meanwhile, Mason continued observing everything. One afternoon, he sat beside Elijah during recreation and asked a question he had been carrying for weeks. "Why did you never tell anyone about your past?" Elijah looked across the yard before answering. "Because it is my past." Mason waited. Elijah continued. "The person I was yesterday cannot do today's work for me." The answer struck Mason harder than he expected. For years, he had built his identity around reputation. Elijah seemed completely free from that need. As the sun lowered over the recreation yard, Mason found himself looking at the older man with a level of respect he never imagined possible. Around them, Blackstone continued its daily routine. Yet something fundamental had changed. The quiet prisoner was no longer viewed as an easy target or an ordinary inmate. People now understood that behind the calm demeanor stood a man shaped by experiences few could imagine. But even with the combat veteran revelation finally exposed, Thomas remained convinced of one thing. The biggest part of Elijah Brooks's story had still not been told. The weeks that followed brought a change nobody inside Blackstone Correctional Facility could ignore. Elijah Brooks had never asked for influence, yet influence seemed to find him anyway. The revelation that he was a combat veteran explained part of the mystery, but it did not explain everything. If anything, the discovery created even more questions. People now understood where some of his discipline came from. What they still did not understand was why someone with his background seemed completely uninterested in recognition. One afternoon, Thomas Reed was helping organize donated books when he came across a magazine featuring an article about leadership development programs. The topic immediately reminded him of Elijah. Later that evening, he carried the magazine into the common area and sat across from the older man. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said. Elijah closed his book and nodded. "Of course." Thomas hesitated. "What made you a leader?" Elijah smiled slightly. "I never set out to become one." Thomas looked confused. "Then how does it happen?" Elijah leaned back in his chair. "Most people think leadership begins when others follow you. It actually begins when you learn to lead yourself." The answer spread through Thomas's mind long after the conversation ended. It was another example of Elijah saying something simple that somehow felt important. Nearby, Mason Carter overheard part of the exchange. Months earlier, he would have dismissed the conversation completely. Now he found himself paying attention. The change surprised him. More surprising was the fact that many other inmates were doing the same. The following week, participation in educational programs reached one of the highest levels staff could remember. Several inmates credited Elijah for encouraging them. Others simply said his example made them reconsider how they spent their time. Elijah never took credit. Whenever someone thanked him, he usually responded with the same phrase. "You made the choice, not me." That attitude only increased the respect people felt toward him. One evening, a staff member stopped by the library while Elijah was working. The officer thanked him for helping several inmates find educational materials. After the officer left, Thomas laughed. "You know, most people would enjoy hearing that." Elijah returned a book to the shelf. "Enjoy hearing what?" "That they are making a difference." Elijah considered the question. Making a difference is important. Needing recognition for it is optional. Thomas shook his head. "You always have an answer." Elijah smiled. "No, I have had more years to think about the questions." Meanwhile, Mason found himself reflecting on his own behavior. The memory of how he had judged Elijah during those first days now bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He remembered assuming silence meant weakness. He remembered believing confidence required intimidation. The longer he observed Elijah, the more those assumptions seemed foolish. One afternoon during recreation, Mason finally spoke honestly. "I was wrong about you," he said. Elijah looked over. "About what?" Mason laughed quietly. "Just about everything." Elijah nodded as if the statement required no further explanation. Everybody gets things wrong sometimes. Mason expected a lecture. Instead, he received understanding. That moment stayed with him for days. Across the facility, Thomas continued researching Elijah's past whenever opportunities appeared. The more he learned, the more impressive the picture became. Yet one detail stood out above all others. Every article, interview, and program reference described achievements. None mentioned ego. The same quality existed inside Blackstone. Elijah carried years of experience without ever using it to elevate himself above others. Late one evening, As lights out approached, Thomas sat alone reviewing his notes. He realized something important. For weeks, he had focused on discovering what Elijah had done in the past. But perhaps that was the wrong question. The more meaningful question was why a man with such a history continued investing his time in helping strangers inside a prison. As the housing unit grew quiet, Thomas glanced across the room. Elijah sat reading beneath the dim lights exactly as he had on his first day. Calm, focused, unchanged. And for the first time, Thomas began to suspect that Elijah's greatest accomplishment had nothing to do with military service at all. It had something to do with the person he had become afterward. As autumn approached, the atmosphere inside Blackstone Correctional Facility felt noticeably different from the day Elijah Brooks first arrived. The change was not dramatic. There were no announcements, no ceremonies, no official recognition. Yet anyone who spent enough time inside the housing unit could feel it. Conversations had changed. Priorities had shifted. More inmates spent evenings studying, reading, or discussing plans for the future. Many of them traced that change back to one person. Elijah never claimed responsibility for any of it. In fact, he seemed almost uncomfortable whenever someone suggested he had influenced others. One evening, while helping organize books in the library, Thomas Reed finally asked a question that had been sitting in his mind for weeks. "Why did you stay so quiet when you first got here?" Elijah placed a book on the shelf before answering. "Because people learn more from observation than introductions." Thomas smiled. "That sounds like something you spent years figuring out." Elijah nodded slowly. "Most valuable lessons take years." The answer stayed with Thomas long after their conversation ended. The more he thought about it, the more he realized Elijah had never tried to convince anyone to respect him. He never defended his reputation. He never mentioned his military background. He simply lived according to the same principles every day. Over time, people noticed. That realization began changing the way Thomas viewed leadership itself. Meanwhile, Mason Carter continued his own transformation. The man who once viewed Elijah as an easy target now found himself seeking opportunities to talk with him. Their conversations were rarely long, but each one seemed to leave Mason with something worth considering. One afternoon during recreation, Mason asked a question that surprised even him. "What was the most important thing you learned during all those years?" Elijah looked across the yard for several moments before speaking. "That strength is often misunderstood." Mason waited. Elijah continued. "Most people think strength means controlling situations. Real strength means controlling yourself when situations become difficult." The answer landed harder than Mason expected. For years, he had measured people based on appearance, confidence, and reputation. Elijah had quietly demonstrated a completely different definition. Later that week, another example emerged. A younger inmate became frustrated after receiving disappointing news from home. Several people attempted to offer advice, but nothing seemed to help. Eventually, the inmate sat alone in the common area. Elijah approached and simply listened. They spoke for nearly 30 minutes. Nobody overheard the conversation. Nobody knew exactly what was said. Yet when the discussion ended, the younger man looked calmer than before. As Elijah walked away, Thomas noticed something important. Elijah never tried to fix people. He helped them find their own direction. That ability explained why so many inmates trusted him. It also explained why his influence continued growing. One evening, Thomas reviewed all the notes he had collected during his search into Elijah's past. Articles, interviews, archived references, military recognition programs, leadership events, combat veteran acknowledgments. The list was impressive, yet something suddenly stood out. Every accomplishment described what Elijah had done. None explained who he had become. Thomas realized that the greatest lesson was not hidden inside old documents. It was unfolding every day inside Blackstone. The next morning, during breakfast, Mason sat across from Elijah and shook his head with a small laugh. "You know something?" he said. Elijah looked up. "What is that?" Mason smiled. "When you first got here, I thought you were the weakest guy in this place." Several inmates nearby chuckled. Elijah smiled too. "And now?" Mason leaned back. "Now I think you might be the strongest." For a moment, the table grew quiet. Elijah considered the statement carefully. Then he shook his head. "No, I just learned a long time ago that reacting is easy. Staying calm takes practice." The answer spread through the table like a wave. Nobody argued with it. Nobody laughed. Because deep down, everyone knew it was true. And as Blackstone settled into another ordinary day, one thing had become clear. The combat veteran story explained Elijah's past, but the quiet wisdom, patience, and discipline he displayed every day explained something far more important. They explained why people respected him now. The following week brought a moment that many people inside Blackstone Correctional Facility never expected to witness. It did not happen during recreation. It did not happen in the cafeteria or the library. It happened during an ordinary evening when most inmates were focused on their own routines. Elijah Brooks sat at his usual table with a book open in front of him. Around the housing unit, conversations drifted between sports, family news, and upcoming program schedules. Nothing seemed unusual. Then Mason Carter approached. Several inmates noticed immediately. By now, seeing the two men speak was not surprising. What surprised people was the expression on Mason's face. There was no confidence to display, no image to maintain. He looked like a man carrying something he needed to say. Mason stopped beside the table and glanced around before taking a seat. Elijah closed his book and waited. For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Mason exhaled slowly. "I owe you an apology." The words immediately drew the attention of a few nearby inmates. Mason rarely apologized to anyone. Elijah simply listened. "When you first got here," Mason continued, "I thought I had you figured out." He laughed softly at himself. "Actually, I never even tried to figure you out. I just made assumptions." Elijah remained silent. Mason looked down at the table before continuing. "I saw your age. I saw how quiet you were. I decided what kind of person you must be." He shook his head. "I was wrong." The housing unit seemed unusually quiet. Even people pretending not to listen were listening. Elijah finally smiled. "Most people make assumptions." Mason nodded. "Yeah, but most people are not as wrong as I was." For the first time, Elijah laughed softly. The tension disappeared almost immediately. "The important thing is what you learned afterward," he said. Mason considered the answer. "That is the strange part." He leaned back in his chair. "I thought strength looked one way. Then you showed up and completely changed that." The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Yet by the time it ended, something significant had happened. The apology was not really about Elijah. It was about growth. Everyone who witnessed it understood that. Later that evening, Thomas Reed reflected on the exchange. Months earlier, Mason would never have admitted being wrong in front of other inmates. Now he had done it without hesitation. The transformation was remarkable. More remarkable was the fact that Elijah never seemed interested in receiving credit for it. The next day, Thomas mentioned the conversation while helping Elijah organize books. "You changed him," Thomas said. Elijah shook his head immediately. "No." Thomas looked confused. "Come on. Everyone can see it." Elijah placed another book on the shelf. "People change when they decide they are ready. Nobody can do that work for them." Thomas smiled. "You really believe that?" Elijah nodded. "Absolutely." The answer sounded simple. Yet Thomas realized it explained almost everything about Elijah's approach to people. He never forced advice on anyone. He never tried to control outcomes. He simply created opportunities for others to think differently. What they did afterward remained their responsibility. As the days passed, the effects continued spreading. More inmates enrolled in classes. More people spent time reading. Several began discussing goals for life after release. Staff members quietly acknowledged the improvement in atmosphere throughout the housing unit. No single event caused the change. It emerged gradually through hundreds of small decisions. And at the center of many of those decisions stood a quiet combat veteran who never asked for recognition. One evening, shortly before lights out, Thomas sat across from Elijah and asked a question he had been saving. "After everything you have done and everything you have experienced, what are you most proud of?" Elijah looked thoughtful. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he closed his book and smiled. "The fact that I am still learning." Thomas stared at him. Of all the answers he expected, that was not one of them. Yet somehow it felt exactly right. As the lights dimmed across Blackstone Correctional Facility, Thomas realized he had finally uncovered the real secret behind Elijah Brooks. It was not military service. It was not leadership training. It was not experience. The real secret was humility. And that lesson was about to leave a lasting mark on everyone around him. Winter arrived at Blackstone Correctional Facility with cold mornings and shorter days, but the changes taking place inside the housing unit had nothing to do with the weather. Months had passed since Elijah Brooks first stepped through the doors carrying a small property bag and a worn paperback book. The quiet newcomer who had once attracted skeptical looks now occupied a very different place in the minds of those around him. Yet if anyone expected Elijah to embrace that reputation, they were disappointed. He remained exactly as he had always been. He reported to work on time. He helped organize the library. He listened more than he spoke. And every evening he sat beneath the same overhead lights reading while the rest of the housing unit moved around him. One afternoon, Thomas Reed found himself thinking about the first day they met. Back then, he had been fascinated by the mystery surrounding Elijah. Now the mystery felt less important than the lessons hidden inside it. The military service, the combat experience, the leadership programs. Those things explained where Elijah came from. They did not explain why so many people respected him. The answer was much simpler. Elijah treated every person with the same level of dignity regardless of status, reputation, or past mistakes. That consistency had changed the culture around him. During recreation that week, Thomas watched several younger inmates discussing educational goals while another group prepared applications for vocational programs. Nearby, Mason Carter was helping a new arrival understand the daily schedule. The sight made Thomas smile. Months earlier, neither scene would have seemed likely. The transformation had happened slowly enough that most people barely noticed it. Yet looking back, the difference was impossible to ignore. Later that evening, a staff member stopped by the library and thanked Elijah for the positive influence he had brought to the facility. As usual, Elijah accepted the compliment politely and redirected the credit toward others. After the officer left, Thomas shook his head. "You really do not like taking credit for anything." Elijah laughed softly. "Credit is temporary. Character stays with you." The answer felt like a perfect summary of everything Thomas had learned. A few days later, Mason approached Elijah one final time during recreation. The conversation was simple. "You know," Mason said, looking across the yard, "when you first got here, I thought being respected meant making sure people noticed you." Elijah nodded. "A lot of people think that." Mason smiled. "Now I think respect happens when people notice how you treat others." Elijah looked at him for a moment before smiling back. "That is a lesson worth keeping." As the weeks continued, Elijah's story gradually became part of Blackstone's unofficial history. New inmates heard about the quiet combat veteran who never talked about himself. They heard about the man who solved problems without seeking recognition. They heard about the prisoner who changed people simply by setting an example. Most importantly, they heard about the mistake many others made when they judged him too quickly. Yet the greatest irony remained the same. Elijah never set out to teach anyone a lesson. He simply lived according to principles he had learned long ago. On his final evening before the story comes to a close, Elijah sat alone with a book open in front of him. Around him, conversations drifted through the housing unit. Some inmates studied. Others planned for the future. A few quietly reflected on their own journeys. Thomas looked across the room and realized something profound. The strongest moment of Elijah's story was not the revelation that he was a combat veteran. It was the realization that true strength had been visible from the very beginning. People simply failed to recognize it. The quiet prisoner everyone underestimated had never needed to prove who he was. Time had done that for him. And in the process, he left Blackstone better than he found it, reminding everyone who crossed his path that the strongest person in the room is often the one who has nothing left to prove.